And I want to open it up now for discussion. If folks have questions in the audience, please do come up to the mics. Remember to identify yourself and your affiliation when you do so. I'm going to kick us off. I heard a couple of you talk about some of the systems changes, and in particular, the school changes to later start times, and the importance of sleep, the importance of that for cognitive development and connecting to middle school brains in a new and different way. Why haven't more systems picked that up, and what can we do to encourage that?
So I brought it up, I guess I will address that. This is not my area of research, and I think what we do talk about it in the National Academy's report, and I also want to mention that as part of Youth Next is a Remaking Middle School working paper on early adolescence, and we talk a little bit about this. I think the challenges tend to be logistical, so thinking about the expenses of busing and transportation. There's some other challenges in thinking about teacher needs and teacher work days and family needs. So in the school division where I live, elementary school students actually do start earliest. Middle school students start the latest, but that means elementary school kids are out of school earliest, so thinking about after school. So I think a lot of those, they are real challenges. But there are school divisions that have successfully been able to do this, but I think it requires a lot of political will, and thinking, how can we manage? When we're getting into secondary schools, extracurriculars become a challenge, and if you're coordinating across school districts within the same region. So all of those things, I think people will say, yes, we understand that there may be benefits, but there's some policy and logistical challenges. And I have talked to my students about this issue when I teach adolescent development, and some of them have lived through when their school division went through these changes, and they said, ideally we understand, but sometimes teenagers still stayed up late anyway. And so the idea of, are they getting more sleep? But I do think on a smaller scale, thinking about how we're managing what's happening after school. If the school day doesn't start any later, what are we asking young people to do during their after-school hours? How we're monitoring things like screen time and bedtime. So those are things that can happen without having to deal with some of the bigger logistics.
Questions from our audience? John, did you want to come up to a mic? Oh, right on the side.
Good morning, John Auerbach from Trust for America's Health. First of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. When we've done some of this work and worked with schools, one of the things that has struck us is that very often schools are identifying that their students have major issues going on in their families and in their lives, but their focus is sort of what takes place during the school day only, and so there ends up being this tension about if the real issues are issues that would involve assisting a family or figuring out how to help a family around, you name it, issues with racism, poverty, whatever the issues are. The schools are sometimes faced with that issue, but really just are dealing with the kids that are there during the hours of the day. How do you think about that? How do you grapple with that in a way that involves the family and maybe looks to addressing what may be causing the problems and not just dealing with the consequences?
So I don't have the answer to that question entirely, and I think that if you ask a school counselor, because that's the lens through which I see the issue, depending on the school where we work, our role will look very, very different. I've been at schools where I've spent a great deal of time trying to source social services and provide resources for families, and I've been at schools where the main issue has been achievement pressure and almost the other end of the spectrum. There's the real versus the ideal. I think what all of us who are in schools are trying to do is recognize that it leaks in, whether or not we feel that we have the competency, and we see that a lot with teachers who are feeling like they don't have the training to address some of the social emotional issues or mental health issues that are coming up. So counselors and educators, I think, have been working more closely than they have in the past, and we do know it from the data that there's more mental health issues. One of the things that that I've been doing is working with teachers to just self-identify as a helper. They don't have to have all the answers. They don't have to be able to do the therapy or connect them specifically to the exact right resource, but we can be a conduit, and we can help as we can according to our level of expertise, and sometimes that's just helping a family that might not know of a resource connect with that resource, but there's just not enough resources.
I also want to briefly, again, reference the National Academies report. I think here, thinking about the need for cross-sector supports and interactions, it can be challenging, but I'm hoping that later today we'll have some conversations about how, for example, the health sector and the education sector can work more closely together. We have some recommendations around thinking about a more active role in providing support for communities that are experiencing economic disadvantage, thinking about the way that we invest in this way in early childhood through programs like Head Start. We could do more of that for secondary school students as well.
And I'll just follow that by saying, if you have a school or a school leader or faculty who's thinking in that way, they're fundamentally denying the importance of context and the role that context plays in the ability of their young people to learn and develop. Further, disabling educators to appreciate the individuality that every young person brings to that school place. And without understanding the context and the nature of individuality, I would say, even when we don't have all the resources to manage every single need that a child brings to school, right? Without appreciating context and the individuality of our young people, we are short-circuiting and undermining the ability of our adults to think creatively about how to leverage resources differently, about how to structure things differently in a way that maybe they haven't seen before, right? So you can understand that you're not going to have all the answers or all the resources that you might want to have, but there is opportunity if you deeply understand what children are bringing to the table and think differently about how you leverage what you do have.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Lourdes Rodriguez, and I serve as director of a unit at the Del Medical School, University of Texas Austin, called Community Driven Initiatives. Thank you so much for your presentations today. I have a few questions about unpacking the data on suicides. So I am assuming that those are completed suicides, but that doesn't include attempted and ideation. So if you could talk a little bit about that and how context, the way in which communication now makes for conversations about the topic easier and more accessible to normalize suicide as an option. And also wondering if the mental health first aid training may be a way to start to support young people around that. Thank you.
One of the characteristics of middle schoolers is that help-seeking behavior isn't something that comes to them intuitively. They don't know when they should be asking for help. They don't know when it's normal changes of puberty and mood fluctuations versus anxiety or clinical depression. And they don't want to snitch. They don't want to tell on a friend. And so programs like Youth Mental Health First Aid or SOS that train kids to identify when they themselves are suffering or when a peer is suffering, and that really emphasize the importance of telling an adult and why that matters more, why saving a life matters more than being perceived as somebody who wouldn't be, a tattletale, is critical to stemming that trend. So the overall trend is about 1 in 5 kids have some form of anxiety or depression. There has been an increase over the years. There are a lot of reasons. Sleep is actually one of them that we're seeing. I heard last night a statistic that kids are getting an hour and a half less sleep per night than they did 150 years ago. And we're seeing the impact of that, and plus social media and everything else, and just the atmospheric anxiety. But in terms of stemming the tide and trying to get kids the help that they need, I think we need to be validating how they feel, normalizing that help-seeking behavior, empowering them. I always ask students, identify the person you would go to in a crisis. And I ask them that several times a year. And I tell them, if you can't think of someone right now who you would go to if you're in a crisis, then I want you to come see me and we'll talk about it and we'll figure it out. Because when you're not clear-headed, you're not going to be in problem-solving mode. And simply asking that question will get them in the mindset of normalizing that help-seeking behavior.
I'll just add one thing to say is, in addition to the context and the relationships that contribute to suicidal ideation and completion, the notion of malleability, the idea that it's never too late for any young mind to develop new neural pathways that lead to resilience and to confidence and to agency, if that young person is surrounded with adults who believe that it's never too late, far different than the messages they're getting from our systems, that it is too late for them to think differently and feel differently about themselves. And so that's why this all kind of comes together. So understanding the nature of the brain is super critical to enabling adults to talk to kids to make those connections.
Yes, and just one last point on that, which is that we need to understand that in this age group, half of suicide is from depression and half is impulsivity. And giving kids those coping strategies and having teachers incorporate mood charts or helping them connect thoughts to feelings to behaviors, helping them understand that feelings don't last forever, that kind of social emotional training is really critical if we want to be able to break that micro moment when they might do something impulsive and fatal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back for our next set of speakers, and thank you very much.